possibly talk to children like children. Not babysit.
Yeah.
I just talked to my guidance and I found the response just fine.
Very much so. Anybody who uses a child voice with children is safe.
Is right. I find it. But then they also repeat that.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes, Karthik.
We are live, sir.
Right.
I knew that. I'm not there. Possibly talk to children like children.
Okay.
I just talked to my guidance and I found the response just fine.
Very much so. Anybody who uses a child voice with children is safe.
I find it. But then they also repeat that.
Yeah.
Hello.
I think they have to mute the
we are
YouTube.
live, sir.
Yeah.
Shall I mute us?
You have to mute the YouTube section. Because...
Possibly talk to children like
All
children.
right. A very
I just talked to my guidance and I found the response just fine.
Very much so. Anybody who uses a child voice with children is safe.
okay.
But then they also repeat that.
Yeah.
Hello.
I think they have to mute the.
We are live, sir.
Yes.
Shall I mute us?
You have to mute the YouTube. All right. I think we're good. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the second edition of Samvad. This initiative, which is a student-run initiative, the Center for New Economics Studies, has been organized with the vision to have a more accessible, decentralized platform for students, young research scholars, to continue engaging with distinguished scholars, thinkers, research scholars working in different areas associated with areas of development studies, sociology, economics, for a critical reflection on what we are finding as the existing climate that's prevailing, affecting not only our political and economic realities, but our social diaspora as well. All members of our core research team tend to participate in the organization of each of the session. So our distinguished guests receive questions in advance based on different thematic areas that are researched based on their own work. And in some cases, we tend to kind of take a leap of faith by asking a few questions over and beyond what they've written about. The broader purpose of each Samvad dialogue is to encourage a more informed process of a collective discussion, which helps us in creating a process of ideation, more importantly among students, enabling them to further push the envelope in research and pick upon new areas of studies in and across social sciences, which is, I think, something we can all agree that is most desperately needed in the higher education landscape with so much happening. This semester's theme, we've called it India's Political Economy Landscape, the Growing Challenges and Possible Resolutions. And with great humility and honor, I welcome Dr. Ratin Roy and Ms. Yamini Iyer with us today. Ratin is Overseas Development Institute's Managing Director of Research and Policy. His policy interests and research has mainly focused on fiscal and macroeconomic issues pertinent to human development in developing and emerging economies. He was former director and CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, and has worked as an economic diplomat and policy advisor at the United Nations Development Program, with postings in London, New York, Kathmandu, and Brasilia. He holds a PhD and MPhil in economics from the University of Cambridge, and MA in economics from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. He's taught at the University of Manchester, and as we were speaking, at SOAS London as well. Ms. Yamini Iyer is the president and the chief executive of Center for Policy Research. Her research interests are in the field of social policy and development. In 2008, Yamini founded the Accountability Initiative at CPR. Big fan, the work that has come out of the initiative. Under her leadership, the Accountability Initiative has produced significant research in areas of governance, state capacity, and social policy. Yamini's own research on social accountability, elementary education, decentralization, and administrative reforms has received both academic and popular recognition. She's a TED Fellow and a founding member of the International Experts Panel of the Open Government Partnership. And I mean, we can go on and on with the information, but she's an alumni of the London School of Economics, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University, and St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining in today. So before we get started, an initiative of ours called InfoSphere, which produces data-based fact sheets on a monthly basis on different given issues of contemporary social and economic policy relevance. We have one of our team leads from the team, Aliva Smriti. She's an undergraduate student in economics from the School of Government and Public Policy, who wanted to make a short presentation just to get us started. And she has a few thoughts that she'd like to share, and we'd kind of get or dive into the questions right after. So with that, Aliva, I think you're here. I'm just going to share my screen and get us. Yeah. Okay, I think everybody can see us fine. Okay, Aliva, you roughly got 8 minutes, so you could just start now.
Good evening. It's an honor to be presenting this snapshot. I am Aliva Smriti. I am one of the team leads of InfoSphere. It is an initiative by Center of New Economic Studies. And I'm here to just present a student's view of what we think of a budget is and how do we look at, according to the topic of today, on the fiscal side of it. So again, as we all know that currently we are looking for a fiscal expansion because the country is under distress. So there are pressing expenditures that the government has to make in healthcare, in supporting the poor and the unemployed, and infrastructure spending to boost growth. Another major concern is the rising discontent amongst the states due to the inadequacy of the federal resources. To start this, let's just give a brief of what a budget exactly is. Most of us are always familiar with household budgets. There are incomes and there are expenditures. Similarly, a government budget is no different. It has incomes, which are tax revenues and non-tax revenues, and it also borrows, which is called the public debt. But unlike a household, the government is not a single unit. We have the state governments and we have the central government. So the taxation is separate out, like the center has its own tax, the state has its own tax, and then a part of the central tax is given to the states. In addition to it, there are grants given from the center to the states. All of these are basically the resources which are used to make expenditures under the constitutional consideration of the 3 lists: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. Professor, can we please move to the next slide? Okay, what is very specific to a government is that a government can borrow in 2 ways: a low-cost way and a high-cost way, which is it can tax people and do auto monetization, which is borrow from the central bank, or it can go the high-cost way, which is borrowing from the market. Naturally, each of them has risks associated with them. Given that there are risks, they have to be mitigated. One of them is called to discipline the fiscal policy. As there were crises of BOP in 1991 and further high deficit numbers during the Vajpayee era, in 2003, India legally mandated the Fiscal Management and Budget Response, the FRBM Act of 2003, which mandated that, which currently mandates that the debt should be at 60%, 40% union, 20% states. To give a snapshot, this is the roadmap, one of the roadmaps, which gives a 3-year projection from the budget 2021 under the document of medium-term fiscal policy, which shows the budget estimate of fiscal deficit to be 3.5, going to 3.3 and 3.1, and the central government debt to be at 50.1, which is higher than the 40, which is mandated in the FRBM Act. Can we please go to the next slide, please? But as of now, we know COVID happened and the GDP collapsed. That means the debt to GDP ratio increased. It is estimated to be around 80 and above by a lot of experts, from what I can get. So one of the concerns is how do we get it back into the line? Uh, Further, because the debt scenario sees that even without COVID, we were on the higher end of average debt and fiscal deficit as compared to other emerging market economies. So even though the current economic survey says that debt might not be a concern, but we do not know how rating agencies or international market is going to view that. Another pertinent thing is that there is a problem with a vertical imbalance between the state and the central. The state has more responsibility of spending, but its resources are not enough. This graph basically shows a scenario till 2016-17, which is pre-COVID and pre-GST. With the introduction of GST, which is basically around a 6% of the GDP as a gap. Professor, can we go to the next slide, please? Here is a basic collection of GST, which has not been able to meet the part it should have. And in this year, it has collapsed further. The GST was an agreement under which the state governments gave up their freedom of financing, which is probably a very high amount of their tax revenue. In exchange, they were promised a 14% growth in revenue every year. And even, but it has not happened so. And the central government failed to meet its mandate this year. Even though, according to the 14th Finance Commission, there has been an increase of the percentage of the tax the union government gives to the state, it has still not been enough. Professor, can we go to the last slide, please? As a conclusion, I'd like to ask the perception of our two esteemed guests today on how can the government increase fiscal resource and spend an allocation for the states? Is disinvestment a way they are looking at? Because in the last budget, they had said that BPCL was going to be sold, which is still not, like the shares of BPCL were going to be sold, but it still has not happened. So are we looking at that being sold and further disinvestment? What is the new debt or deficit path? How long is it now going to take to come to the mark of 60% of debt to GDP ratio? And what are exactly we are looking forward to in the 15th Finance Commission report and the budget of 21-22? Also, do you believe there to be a change in the way the tax revenue is given to the state?
All right. So I think we'll now open up the space to the guests. Or we could start with the questions if you want me to do that. But I think maybe just if you could respond with some thoughts on the presentation first, and then we'll get into the conversation. Dr. Roy Ramini. I think you'd have to unmute. We can't.
Can I just compliment you first on, I thought, a lovely presentation, very, very interesting and very comprehensive. I resist my teaching instincts. There were two errors there, which are not your fault. They're errors that most economists make. So I'll email you. So the questions, can you put up that slide again on the questions, please? Thank you. Yes. So let me leave the blue box to Yamini, and let me sort of confine myself to talking about the red box. The question is not whether government can create more fiscal resources to spend and allocate more funds to the state. The question is, for any fiscal resource, which entity should be spending it? The Constitution provides us with a guide, which broadly says that the core responsibility of the central government is to spend money to ensure that services that state governments cannot provide are provided by the center. Importantly, these include, in fiscal terms, the most important of them is defense, internal security, and railways. So the first question we have got to ask is the central government delivering these services effectively? In addition to that, the central government may choose, largely for reasons of ensuring that all Indian citizens have common access to a minimum level of public services, to invest in public services. And then the question becomes, is the central government best empowered to do that by doing it directly, or should the states do it directly? If the states, as is the case in India in large measure, are doing it directly in any case, the government of India does not run health services or education services to any significant extent in the states, right? Or even employment guarantee schemes for that matter. Then the question becomes, why should the government of India be giving money to the states? Why not just give the states the money and let them spend it? So these are the questions I think we need to focus on in addressing the first question. It's not a matter of allocating more funds to the state. The public finances available to the governments of India have to be shared. The center does not have automatic priority on them, except for the base functions that I mentioned. Once those are done, this has to be decided on the merits of the case. What is the scope for disinvestment of the government? Infinite. Huge. The government of India in particular is in the situation of many sick companies. They're income poor but asset rich. They cannot collect taxes. They find it difficult to collect revenues, non-tax revenues, but they have large amounts of assets. Always remember, the government of India is the largest landowner in the country, and the government of India is the largest shareholder in the country. So if the government of India wants to enhance its ability to spend money to improve either welfare or India's future economic prospects, then it has the ability to do so by either using its assets or selling them to get resources to fulfill its objectives. So the scope is not a problem. The elephant in the room is, why does the government of India, having decided to disinvest, consistently fail to do so? We can take that up later if you wish. What should be the new debt deficit correction path strategy in the medium to long term for this union government? There should not be one. There should be an effectiveness of public spending strategy, where the government of India can demonstrate that when it borrows money or when it taxes, it is able to spend these in ways that tangibly improve either the quality of lives or the growth prospects of this country or its national security. I don't care which. That needs to be how we look at the future. Because when we borrow or we incur debt, we want the money to be well spent. And if it is not well spent, then we should not incur it. So it is now the time has come to stop doing these crude, primitive, accountancy-based measures of debt servicing that we're all taught in grad school, which I junked the moment I left grad school, but not to ask the question how much, or just the question how much, but to ask the question on what and how effective. That is what a medium-term framework does, and that is why our government has consistently avoided putting in place one, so you will never ask that question. And you'll be forced to only ask the question how much, because that is all the current budget instrumentation allows you to do. Yamini, the blue ones for you, please.
Thanks. Before I go to the blue ones, I just wanted to add a little bit to the red one. The first question that you pose about the government raising more fiscal resources, let me also talk about it not so much from the point of view of the resources that we have and the sharing of those resources between the center and states. There's also the question of what are the resources that we are raising? Where can we raise resources for the state in and of itself? And the obvious story there is the story of taxation. There's a very important political economy question that we need to always bear in mind when we have debates on taxation in India. And so the economists will tell you two things, right? Ultimately, the state needs to have a strong taxation base. The political expectations on what the state is to deliver are vast. And given the stage we are in our development, those expectations are only going to grow as people's aspirations and the expectation of the quality of public services that the state provides are going to be, those demands are getting louder and more vocal. Don't forget that much as the Indian state, by this I don't mean center state, I mean the state as the nation state, we think of the state always as this large bureaucracy, people with all these lazy, corrupt, incompetent, inefficient people. The state is the largest employer. But just by virtue of size in terms of per capita employment, the Indian state is actually much smaller than even the United States, which by all definition is a very small state. Actually, India has to invest a lot of resources, even in the good times, in its state. Ultimately, the source of that investment comes from taxation. And the real political economy with taxation in India, it's not an economist question of what you should tax in order to ensure that you're incentivizing more economic activity. It is about the willingness of the people to pay tax. And there, the credibility of the state and the credibility of the state to deliver both basic public services, but also to create an enabling environment for business matters significantly. And unfortunately, way before the present that we are talking about, even back in 1991, the credibility of the Indian state for basic service, for the delivery of basic services and for creating an enabling environment for business has always been low. So even in the good times, private capital, which is always incentivized to fight to pay less tax, has only engaged with the government from the point of view of how do I get the government out of my way and how do I pay less tax. So the decisions on what to tax and not tax and where you're giving tax holidays are less about creating incentives for sectors to grow and much more than about the oligarchic capitalism that we confront, about the overlay of the dynamic between politicians and the state and where you get those tax holidays. And the ordinary citizen that is asked to pay tax is looking at a state where essentially core public services are not provided for them. So we privatize our water. The clean water that we all drink in our homes in taps is all filtered with private purchase of RO water filters and so on. We have privatized our security, basic public good. Most houses in Delhi and Haryana, where all of you are, in fact, Jindal itself has a private security guard. You can't rely on the state for that. We privatized our education. I went to a private school. You all are in a private university. So the tax-paying Indian, in fact, has mostly exited from the state, and therefore is the dynamic that of citizens and state is framed in one of tax avoidance rather than a willingness to pay tax, happy to be taxed in order to be able to provide, in order to be able to be a recipient of the public goods that the government has to provide me. Until we don't break that dynamic, for the future of the Indian state beyond the pandemic, the tax base has to be enlarged, but it will only be enlarged well when the state is able to enhance its credibility vis-a-vis its people. And therefore, even the very, very basic things, you gave us a presentation with budget numbers. Ratin and I were just before this looking at the budget numbers, looking at our the finance accounts numbers that the CGA has just put up. And they always leave you puzzled because consistently and now in a much more exaggerated way, the government of India's fiscal numbers lack basic credibility. So if I cannot trust my government for what it is telling me is its revenue raising capability and its expenditure commitments and its fiscal deficit and where and what it's borrowing for and what it's going to spend on, I'm highly unlikely to be willing to take my limited earnings to give to the government because I actually need to save to buy my own education, to buy my own healthcare, to buy my own roads and to buy my own security. That's the political economy of taxation that we need to think about. I think Ratin actually covered a lot about the center state story in his remarks, and I'm sure we'll be picking up on this federal dimension as we go forward. But I did want to make this political economy point on taxation.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, thank you for those excellent opening remarks. So just to structure the conversation for today, we've already dived into the theme one. We had three themes identified. One was on the political economy of fiscal responsibility, a title from a piece that Dr. Roy had written a few weeks ago, and it was particularly, I think, apart from the arguments put forth, there were a lot of interesting thoughts that if we can get into a little bit on that, would help us get more clarity on what you had in mind when you were writing the piece at that period. And of course, the second theme we wanted to look at today was the rising inequality in India, which is a matter of grave. Of course, we tend to kind of look a lot at Oxfam studies to get our understanding of what's happening when you're looking at numbers, but it's for us to see on day-to-day life. On the work that we were doing back at the center recently with labor, the informal labor markets, the Mazdoor Mandis, where workers go, daily wage workers go on a day-to-day basis to find work. Almost 80% in the survey we did, of course, it was a heterogeneous small sample of around 200 workers we could talk to, but we interviewed all of them. And almost 80% of them were surviving entirely on government ration, which had entirely their households. And 50% of them never received it in the first place. And that sends, and this is the state of UP, we're now kind of doing work in Pune. So, it is glaring, and we cannot kind of move away from our conversation there. The third theme is to look at this trust and credibility issue, which Yamin has put out on the changing delta of social and political contract, which is underlying the change in economic direction, that you have the policy making landscape, which is largely being guided by, let's say, more rhetorical and political principles than sound market principles as a whole. And I don't say that for everything, but definitely in terms of the overall direction where we find there is a lack of vision and coherency. So the first question on that, just drawing in from the article that Dr. Roy had written, and I can quote you from there. India's response to the two false binaries developed on the discourse around fiscal policy by multilateral institutions like the IMF and OECD has been more nuanced. But there is no denying that fiscal hawks invoked, in quotes, sustainability and quotes counter-cyclicality as the main drivers in advocating for a fiscal responsibility framework. So as a member of the 2016 Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Committee, you've mentioned on the importance of creating a system of checks and balances on the government's power to tax, borrow, and spend. Could you elaborate first on the three arguments that you put forward, what you had in mind? And which are the key areas, let's say, if one was to ask you, that you would want the government to spend and borrow, let's say, more for over the next 2-3 years, assuming the argument you've been making that a medium-term fiscal plan was possible?
Yes, thank you. So let me, since we have students here, explain something. When you are taught debt sustainability or you read one of those wretched textbooks, what are you told? You are told that government should not incur more debt. Why? Then you're told no, because the debt has to be sustainable. What is sustainable? Then you're told that debt is sustainable when it's relative to the income earned by the country, the debt of the government must not increase in the long term. And if you can identify a path where the debt of the government does not increase over the long term relative to its income, then the debt is sustainable. Now, if you think about a rich country, a typical rich country before COVID, those countries don't grow much because they have attained more or less the full employment capacity of their resources. The only thing there that promotes growth is technology and productivity. Standard economics, right? Most of your economics students, you've heard of the Solo Romer, sort of. So in a developed country, the problem is not the growth rate of GDP and the growth rate of debt. That's a minor problem. The problem is that while the trend growth rate of GDP may be low or almost zero, maybe 1%, that's small. Sometimes it goes down and sometimes it goes up. And that is called a cycle. It's a polynomial in 3 degrees, which is identified as something called a cycle. And for the illiterate and uneducated data-driven economist, they then spend the rest of their lives looking at the data and finding polynomials. Okay, this is what I call data coolies. Plenty of them in India. Many of our think tanks have. All they do is look at the data and say cycle hai. Arey Baba, but why should it be a cycle? I'm saying this to you for a very important reason, which I'll come to. Anyway, the real theory of a business cycle is this, that when things go well, then people tend to think that things will get even better. And therefore people invest more than they would have in the hope for a better future. Because unlike us, or at least unlike the economists, they don't know that they're at steady state. And at the household level, they don't know they're at steady state. So they think I can improve my prospects by consuming and investing more. But the boundaries to that are already determined by the fact you're close to full employment. So what you end up doing then is what is called overheating the economy. Equally, when for some reason things go below the trend rate of growth, people get pessimistic. They start taking precautions. They don't invest. They consume less. That further reduces demand. That further reduces investment. That further lowers the growth rate. In both these cases, government, knowing the fact that we are at full employment equilibrium and this is below or above that, there are 2 ways of looking at it, business cycle theory and what is normally called potential output. You say there's an output gap, right? And then what you do is, as government, you step in and you spend more when people are spending less, and you spend less when people are spending more. So when you want to spend more when people are spending less, you will have less taxes at that time, so you will have more debt. But when people are spending more on the upswing, you will have more taxes. So like a munim, like an accountant, the economist's job becomes to engage in what is called counter-cyclical actions. Cut to emerging economies. And this really makes me angry. Even this CA has done it. Counter-cyclical, counter-cyclical, counter-cyclical. You're not in a cycle because you're not at full employment output. There is a great paper by Geeta Gopinath and David Aguirre called The Trend is the Cycle. I recommend it to you.
Yeah.
What happens in our countries is we are growing. But in that journey of growth, we are constantly being shocked. We are being shocked by agricultural disasters. We are being shocked by climate events. We are being shocked by riots. We are being shocked by farmers at Singhu border. Not be bad shocks from a political perspective, but there are constant shocks happening to the economy. Bad banks, corruption, all sorts of rubbish happens. So rubbish happens and rubbish gets you off your trend growth rate. But when it gets you off your trend growth rate, sometimes the shocks can be permanent also. And they can be up shocks or down shocks. Now, if you're a data coolie and you look at the data, you will find a polynomial in 3 degrees. Say, this is a business cycle because you've never understood the theory. Right? In this circumstance, what do you use fiscal policy for? You use fiscal policy essentially to make sure that the shocks to trend are minimized and that broadly the beneficence of having a trend that results in an increase in growth up to the point where your resources are fully employed is executed efficiently. So the task is very different from that of a rich country. Okay. So then what are we saying? Obviously, in this kind of situation, you want everything to fire. So as you remember, the GDP identity, consumption plus investment plus government plus exports minus imports. So you want to export more, you want to import less, you want to invest more, you want to consume more, and you want government spending to go up. In which case, why should I have any limits on government spending at all? There are some reasons to have limits on government spending if your savings are low, because ultimately, the only way the government can spend more is by taxing somebody. So if I tax somebody, then either they will have to pay that tax by consuming less or saving less. And therefore, then what government spends on must contribute more for growth than the loss in consumption and saving of the person who has been taxed. But when government borrows, who does it borrow from? It borrows from savers. So then the question becomes, is government using these savings better than other people who might use these savings? So these are the broad questions that we ask. But notice that these questions we are asking are questions about how, not about how much. So then why should the level of debt matter? I say it matters not a bit. Particularly if, as in the Indian case, all government borrowing is domestic. Because if you're going to borrow abroad, which is a terrible idea, and I've opposed it successfully when they almost tried to do it in this idiotic fashion 3 years ago. They did many idiotic things that year, and we're paying the price now. Then, of course, there's a net reduction in national income because then foreigners own your savings. And I don't need to tell any Indian about this who has studied some history. Go and read the history of the East India Company. Luckily, we avoided it 3 years ago. But since we only borrow domestically, what happens? Think of this entire Zoom team. Suppose now I'm the government and I borrow 10 rupees from each of you, and I'm part of this group. What has happened to total income in this room? Nothing. Right? So in principle, it sounds very attractive. You could just go on borrowing and go on spending. Then why have any kind of FRBM? 3 reasons. The first reason you need an FRBM is, remember that fiscal policy is a use of government coercive power. Remember, you can go to jail if you don't pay taxes. You can go to jail if you don't pay taxes. You don't go to jail if you fail to pay somebody for the price of bananas. You don't even go to jail if you're Vijay Mallya. But you can go to jail if you don't pay your taxes. You can it is easier for the income tax, for the revenue department of the government of India to tap my phone than it is for the Ministry of Home Affairs, at least until recently. Now I think anybody can tap my phone. But until recently, when we had a civilized country, it was easier for the revenue department always to tap my phone than the others. When you're allowing government this level of coercive power over you, you must have a responsibility framework that makes sure that the government is using this coercive power wisely, just like we have for the police. Well, not in India maybe, but in other civilized countries, we have a responsibility framework where police excesses are condoned. We have courts, unlike in India, that restrict these excesses. Yes? So that is one very important reason. The second is, when I said that debt is free, that is only true if I take 10 rupees from everybody. But in reality, what happens? You borrow. Who do you borrow from? So government goes where? Goes to the banks. Who puts money in banks? Savers. Who saves more? Rich people. So the government borrows disproportionately from rich people. What does it then do? It pays them interest. Right? So the government borrows money, it spends it on increasing the growth rate, and it pays back the principal and interest to rich people. And that creates inequality. Right? Think of it, I take 100 rupees from Mr. Ambani if he ever gives it to me. I borrow it from him, because he puts it in a bank by some miracle. And I build a road. And then Mr. Ambani gets his money back, he also gets back 10% interest. And then he drives his car on that road. Somebody else who is not Mr. Ambani only gets the road. Ambani gets the road and he can drive his car on it and he gets his money back with interest. So typically when you borrow, you are paying the rich for the privilege of developing their own country. And people forget this. This is much more important than that accountant's notion of debt sustainability. That is the second reason. The third reason is that when you either borrow or spend or tax, both for coercive power reasons and borrowing reasons, you have to know what the government is spending on. You need information, included but not limiting to data. But if the agency that is going to be judged on the data is also responsible for producing, evaluating, and validating the data, then you're going to get moral hazard. And you're seeing it today, every day you're seeing it. So you need some kind of a framework that also assesses that the data that is being presented to you is accurate, credible, not necessarily transparent, at least accurate and credible and verifiable. These are the 3 elements that you need in a fiscal responsibility framework. I hope I've tried to make it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
Let me summarize.
Yeah.
The state is coercive. Coercive elements need control, and therefore you need a responsibility framework. Borrowing sounds like a good idea, but it is unequalizing. You have to balance the inequality against how the government is spending its money. That requires a responsibility framework. And the same agent that is judged on the data it produces is responsible for producing the data. That cannot be accepted. Therefore, you need a responsibility framework. 3 reasons. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Yamini, just on drawing from one of the articles you wrote, this was for the Hindustan Times, titled "Creating an Inclusive Welfare Architecture." You say, and I quote, As recommended by the World Bank, the center can, alongside core national schemes like Manrega and PDS, repurpose its 400 plus social protection transfer schemes into one umbrella scheme, but leave states to design interventions to their needs. Political credit and blame can be apportioned across center and states, sorry. The 2021 budget is an opportunity to implement this much needed reform. So one of our students had this question: if you could step into the shoes of the finance minister, how would you implement such a proposal in context to the upcoming budget? Could you give us some illustrations of past examples, or let's say a reference to a study which, for example, or recommendations that the World Bank has given to another country and where this has been done? Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
So if I were to step into the finance minister's shoes for one day, I would do the following. I would get rid of all the centrally sponsored schemes that are financing social policy. And I would instead enhance tax devolution to states, ensure that my bureaucrats who are incentivized to hold on to money, because in bureaucracy, budget is power, shed themselves of this desire for power and find perhaps another source of power, which is in showcasing the quality of what they do, and actually allow states to determine what they want to prioritize in accordance with their peculiar development trajectories, and enable them with any kind of support that states may require to be able to fulfill those goals. Now, let me explain what I mean by all of this, which explains also the 400 plus, and 400 plus, by the way, is a very, very conservative figure of the number of schemes that we have. The story is this: the Indian Constitution, very clearly, as Ratin told us, has allocated a set of core functions. It's a guide. It has allocated a set of core functions that the government of India, the union government, should perform, and a set of core functions that it believes that the state governments ought to fulfill. And although the founders of our constitution perhaps did not study core public finance principles with as much care as Ratin has, they had their instincts absolutely right. There are core public finance reasons why certain functions of the state are allocated at certain levels of the state. And in particular, the reason why agriculture, health, education, which is now on the concurrent list, but in the original form was a state subject, social protection, civic services are all allocated at the state level, is for a fundamental 101 public finance reason, linked also, by the way, to a fundamental 101 first principle of accountability as well. The closer the service is to citizens, the more effectively citizens can hold the state accountable for them. All these are services that are deeply transaction intensive. There's deep variation. So the public health needs in Bihar are going to vary from the public health needs of Kerala. They will vary for historical reasons because these locations have different developmental pathways. They will also vary for spatial and geographical reasons. The kind of diseases you will see in Bihar will be very different to the kind of diseases you will see in Kerala. And on that basis, the government of Kerala will make the decisions it needs to make. The government of Bihar will make the decisions that it needs to make. And if the people of Bihar do not like those decisions, they can, because they can see what is happening, they can directly hold their governments to account. And in the elections, they will make the choices that they have to make. That is first principles. But of course, first principles doesn't account for politics. And in politics, particularly when you have when in this sort of national and state politics, and you have a central, you have national governments and state governments, national parties and state parties, you inevitably see a political dynamic that plays out. India always had this thing called centrally sponsored schemes back from the British era. The British had introduced centrally sponsored schemes to provide specific special fiscal transfers to states, particularly in times of famine. And the idea was that when a state is fiscally stressed in a particular, under a particular set of circumstances, it is the center's responsibility to step in, again, by virtue of Public Finance Principles 101, minimum standards of public services to all citizens of a country. So it is the responsibility of the center to provide equalizing support to states, particularly in times of need, and it was being done through this centrally sponsored scheme mechanism. We adopted those centrally sponsored scheme mechanisms when we, once post-independence. And once the Planning Commission was created, the Planning Commission became the home for these centrally sponsored schemes. Now, don't forget, Planning Commission is not a constitutional body. That's why it was so easy to dismantle it too. And therefore, within the constitutional architecture of center-state fiscal relations, centrally sponsored schemes weren't a mandate. The constitutional architecture of center-state fiscal relations very clearly articulates that there is a horizontal and vertical imbalance, and it is the job of the center that has been given far greater taxation powers than the states to then, through an independent statutory finance commission, determine on the basis of a transparent formula how taxes will be allocated across states. That's why Ratan emphasized that it's not center's taxes and state taxes, it is shared taxes. The taxes that we pay are the taxes for all of India, not just for the government of India, and the Finance Commission determines how we allocate them across. But if states are implementing social programs, then center doesn't get credit. And so the centrally sponsored schemes became a very useful vehicle for national governments to start taking on credit and receiving direct credit for programs that they were implementing, particularly in the direction of poverty alleviation, because that became a very critical part and parcel of the dynamics of our political economy. We can talk about why that was so, but that's the case. And when the Congress in the 1970s lost its dominance across the country at the state level, the Congress at the national government needed levers to be able to ensure it keeps its national political hold, and the centrally sponsored schemes with Indira Gandhi's Garibi Hatao political narrative became the tool. There are many studies that have looked very closely at the allocation of centrally sponsored scheme funds across states. And because these are discretionary, these are not formula based, and the Finance Commission doesn't take a view on the basis on which you will allocate centrally sponsored schemes, there was also a very clear, visible political bargaining. So states that had parties at the who were being governed by the same party at the center received a little bit more. Just before an election, some more allocation would come. A political game was certainly being played out. But this instrument went from being one type of fiscal transfer mechanism for equalization in times of crisis or for special national goals to becoming a crucial political tool for governments at the center to apportion credit. But our federal system is unique. Implementation was always in the hands of states. And when we didn't have the kind of centralizing national government that we have currently, and there was a lot of pulls and pressures with states would take full electoral credit for implementing these schemes. States were also clever enough to discover that because the center was giving money for what are state subjects, and states had to, the bulk of state budgets for health, education, and so on would go in for wages and liabilities. Fiscal hawks showed up and said you have to pass fiscal responsibility acts. That meant that states had to start cleaning up their budgets a little bit. And what they did then was to say, oh, this is great. I'll take the centrally sponsored money, use it for various expenditures that are actually state expenditures, substituting using the monies that you would have ordinarily allocated for other things. So in fact, these centrally sponsored schemes, which are meant to essentially ought to have been top-ups to what states were spending on health, education, social protection, pensions, and so on, became the dominant source of non-wage and wage expenditure. And so it kind of worked very well, both in terms of providing the fiscal room that states wanted, as well as giving states the political credit that they needed. So Manrega, or which at the time was called Narega when it was first implemented by the UPA, became a much sought after social program that helped a lot of BJP governments, mind you, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh back in the day, And in fact, in 2009, when the UPA came back to power, and it was widely believed that their successful implementation of Narega was one of the factors that contributed, they were very worried that states were beginning to rename, opposition states were renaming Narega, whatever the names they chose, Deen Dayal National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Therefore, they changed the name to Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, because no politician will want to meddle with with the nation's father. So it became National Mahatma Gandhi. So there's a very clear political economy story there. Now, what has happened in this process is that successive governments launching their own schemes for their own political capital created a huge labyrinth of schemes. And in fact, when the 15th Finance Commission was first set up, they had this meeting where they were talking about central sponsored schemes. And this is some of the country's finest financial bureaucrats that have governed our financial institutions for years. Dr. N.K. Singh was expenditure secretary. He was in the PMO. Even he had no clue how many centrally sponsored schemes and central sector schemes we have and who holds the data for it. So we actually have 400 plus schemes. We calculated that number, the World Bank calculated that number, and I helped them on the back of what's on the DBT site. The real number is probably more. By the way, states are no better. They too have many of these programs. And so we have this very clunky, very cluttered, and it is Government of India that passes these, that creates these schemes and then commands states on how to spend. So the National Health Mission, which started out with 5 budget line items in 2005, today has 2,000. And the job of a district magistrate and the chief medical officer in a district by district variation in health indicators, NFHS data will tell you that, their only job is to look at that Excel sheet of 2,000 line items, allocate a number, and eventually the finance minister will give you some allocation at the end. There's no connection between the reality on the ground and how we make our budgets. So in an ideal world, we shouldn't have these schemes at all. It should be for the states, and the people of the state will use the electoral process to hold the system accountable. In the world in which we live, where political credit matters, we will always have this kind of thematic, scheme-based architecture. And the only politically sensible approach, therefore, to addressing this anomaly and this complexity is to say, keep your scheme, create this basket, but for God's sake, don't determine step by step what the states should do. Let them choose what they need. In times of crisis, like we saw during the lockdown, people were moving. It was very clear some states will need a much more rural-centric social protection system. Some states will need a much more urban-centric social protection system. It should have been for states to decide whether they want to do Manrega or cash, depending on their circumstances. Unfortunately, it was the Government of India and particularly the Prime Minister's office that was making those decisions, leaving states to implement whatever was told. So we need that basket so states can pick what makes sense for them and their developmental needs.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the second theme because I want to get one question and get your thoughts both on this. This is on the rising inequality argument. And Yamini, you'd written this going back to an article you wrote in 2020, The People versus the Indian State. You say, bringing India onto a sustainable path of long-term growth and charting a new course for agrarian transitions will require a politics of trust, credibility, inclusion, and consensus building, the point that you were iterating a while back. The government may still brazen it out, but the policy agenda and credibility is considerably weakened. End of quote. So given the inability of the government, the way we are seeing the farmers' protests, unpacking the low-class migrant labor crisis, how has the current economic crisis or the crisis of political economy widened this crisis of trust, credibility, and lack of consensus building, if you want to elaborate a little bit there? And Ratan, just on that response there itself, do you agree with Yamini's views on this crisis of trust, credibility, which is affecting what you would see as the state-citizen contract? And this has serious ramifications for not only making the relationships between economic agents, households, firms, government worse, but even across these agents, that is interactions with external sector, or there's this obsession with trying to increase our exports. And as you've argued extensively on why that's not the most salient approach, you have a wide enough domestic demand base to be able to look at. So how does this play in? Because this is connected to the third theme on the social and political contract. If you could, I mean, you could go in first and then.
I'll try and do this as quickly as possible. I think, look, there is a very important bifurcation that is taking place in our political landscape in contemporary India. And that bifurcation is a bifurcation between the electoral choices that we are making and our, as a citizenry, our reactions to the dynamic of statecraft that we are witnessing with the governments in power. So it's important to say that, because when we talk about trust and credibility, the one response that comes back again and again is that the government of the day, and in particular the Prime Minister of the day, is an extremely popular man. And in fact, election after election, you do see him. Of course, we are seeing some variation at the state level, no doubt. But if we have a national election tomorrow, despite all the things that we say, then in all likelihood he will come back. That bifurcation is important to keep in mind, because in fact, politics is certainly about power, grabbing power and holding on to power. But it is also about your statecraft once you get power, and your ability then to pursue the kind of agendas that you want to access and then hold on to power for. And I think it is in that statecraft that today we are seeing a complete breakdown and a reaction from the citizenry in different ways and forms. And I think the farmers' protests are very much a visible evidence of precisely just this. And what it does is that it is weakening the policy agenda of this government in a many of the policy, both in terms of economic policy, but also in terms of the larger cultural agenda that is unfolding, in ways that the people of India are sort of saying, you need to have a conversation with us first. And even though, let's take the CAA, for example, where in many ways you could say that the conversation on the ideological trajectory of India and whether or not a majoritarian polity is what the people of India are seeking, even that, the people's response was a little bit more around, we need to have that conversation for much longer before we are convinced. So you see that the CAA rules were notified, but implementation remains on hold. And the farmers, of course, because it's not directly linked to the political agenda. But there's another element in here, which is also, I think, it has been very significant to see that farmers, who are in fact capital of all factors of production, the left are about labor versus capital, and the landed farmer has always been at the receiving end of left politics. So the fact that landed farmers are talking about Adani and Ambani in these protests is not because the landed farmer has been captured by the left. In fact, it's very interesting. The landed farmer and the landless and the laborer are coming together in this current protest. It is because since 1991, even though we have advocated, and I think to a very great degree, the people of India have actually believed this, that free markets are good for India in the long term, we have not been able to demonstrate a credible pathway for free markets which enhance the bargaining power of all market players. Our path to capitalism has been embedded in cronyism. It is what many call oligarchic capitalism. Today, there are two leaders who dominate almost every sector of the economy. That's something to think about. And I think that part of this protest is also a demonstration of just this. The reason why even the most powerful political constituency in India, the farmer, who's been able to bring this government to its knees in ways that many other political constituencies have not, is talking about Ambani and Adani, is because even the most powerful political constituents knows that they will not be able to be free players and have strong bargaining power in a market that is dominated by oligarchic capitalists. That's the fundamental underlying political economy of credibility that we need to talk about when we talk about reforms in India.
Okay, Ratan?
Well, I encourage and admire Yamini's optimism. But I must say three things. We'll try and keep them short. The first is that contrary to popular belief of what brainwashing you have done, and I want the students here, think about your own lives, maybe exceptions. From the time you're born, the time you go to school, the time you find a job, India is a chaotic, authoritarian society based essentially on lack of trust and the refusal to trust. I think most women in this audience would know what I'm talking about. You begin your lives and you end your lives on the predication that even if you wish to be trusted, your parents, your husband, your children, your society will not trust you. I have never seen so much fuss. After coming back to India, I was very disappointed, 2014, about leave applications. People second-guess leave applications. I promise you that does not happen in the rest of the world. You have an allotted time that you want to take off. The default is you take it off. When I came to India, I was shocked at the number of signatures I had to provide just to, put a salary thing out, affidavits, self-affidavit. It's a low-trust society because it is a weakly governed society. What evidence can I give you that we are weakly governed? We are weakly governed and we are low trust again because we are a highly individualized society where individuals at the same time face a lot of repression, and therefore the default is to find pathways around that repression, but to respond to repression silently when it comes. I'm going to give you a very odd example of that: traffic. Look at this bizarre country. Look at the traffic out there. Why is the traffic problem happening? It's not because of lack of policing. It's because we don't wish to obey rules. And we don't wish to obey rules because that is how we are. Mr. Akhilesh Yadav, one day I was driving with him and he said he'd drive me to Lucknow airport because we were talking. And at one point I looked at a light and he said, this is the only traffic light in Lucknow. So I said, why? He said, they don't work. And I said, why? And in Hindi he said, because villages don't have traffic lights. So if you think about a village, if you think about how people respond, if you think about how many people drive on the wrong side of the road, drive without helmets, if you think about workers without, if you think about people, sort of how they use public toilets, if you think about anything. It is basically a low trust, but also an anarchic society because people are responding in low trust anarchic ways. But if the overlay is one in which authority forces you to obey the law by punishing you, you will obey. It's a very difficult situation to get out of. The same is true for state-society relations, industry relations, etc. That's my first point. The second point is, in that overlay, if you are able to create, Mr. Modi says this very often, and people don't take him seriously. You should take him very seriously. He said, halfway through growing his beard in the pandemic, that when we Indians decide to do something, we will go and do it. He was saying a profound thing. He was saying that is a rare event, when we Indians decide. And the objective of the ruling party's manifesto is very similar to Nehru. He wants to create a consensus where we Indians decide to do something. Have you read the BJP manifesto? Anybody? Please do. It's a very important document. They said we will build the Ram Mandir. They said we will abolish Article 370. They said we will bring a uniform civil code. They have done it with the popular will and mandate of the people of India. So what's all this fuss about? Now, if you're asking why they do not perform in the economy, it is because these trust-based coalitions that they have managed to build to deliver on their key promises outside the economy have been based on a clearly thought out ideology. But the BJP, to my utter regret, has no economic ideology. You want to find a libertarian in the BJP? I'll give you one. You want to find somebody babbling in the finance ministry about culture and economics, I'll give you one. You want to find a proto-communist, it's called Swadeshi Jagrat Bunch. They have everything and therefore they have nothing. The RSS has themselves complained to me about this. We will never be able to do anything. Because any idea comes, anybody comes from a pawn shop, says something, you try it out, you're not sure, you don't have consensus. You don't have the same kind of ideological ability to convince that Nehruji had when he convinced us to make investments above our pay grade. When he, in effect, convinced this country not to mention the word poverty. Are you aware of this? The word poverty came up for the first time in a policy document in 1969. Okay. So the trust issue is a given. The dynamics of solving it comes when ideology is used to create a popular consensus that is nevertheless always authoritarian. Nehru ji karenge great hai, hamara kaam hai unko support karna. Modi ji karenge great hai, hamara kaam hai unko support karna. That is the situation you're finding. Now what this can do, I'm afraid, and you must read in a very good article I read today by Manjari Karju, it's a very good article for students in today's India Forum, on it's wrong to call things fascist, as she rightly says, on authoritarian, weak authoritarian regimes. So you're running a weak government, a low-trust society, you husband your political capital in certain ways. The typical result of that is long-term economic stagnation and a long-term abandonment of the goal of collective increasing prosperity, which has informed my entire patriotism for the rest of my life. It's a very depressing thing for me to say. But that is possible. It is possible you will live the next 25 years of your life like people in the Philippines have lived, like people in Franco Spain can live. वो picture बहुत चलता है दुनिया में. Now, if we cannot collect our aspiration and come up with an equalizing economic ideology that enables us to offer a counter narrative, then all you will be left with is that political ideology on which a consensus is formed.
Just to conclude on this, and because I know we're running out of time, there is this, I mean, just on the final thematic area, just one question, and most of the points have been already covered. I'm just relaying across a column that Professor Mehta had written a few years ago. This is from a column for the Indian Express, where he writes, and I quote, "The intellectual focus of the debate on the 91 economic reforms was largely on themes of globalization, deregulation, and as an afterthought, spending the gains of growth on health and education, something we did very poorly on." I mean, the related questions, just to draw our last kind of remarks from our speakers onto this, is that we're seeing a sustained rise in majoritarian authoritarianism, a kind of one which maybe one might argue that societies have seen in different cycles, 1930s, prior to that, or even post that, as national and global circumstances continue to change. To what extent do you see that the role of the Indian nation state once again has come into this quote unquote contention? The contention that was evident before at any point of time. Predominantly what one is trying to, I think, ask here is, what are the areas that you would see would require a radical rethinking in the nature of institutional politics, of course, which some of the points you've already talked about, but do so in more of a process and also a consequential manner. I think the question I put there was using the word deontological, but I'll just, for the purpose of the audience, say a nature of reform in policy thinking, economic and social policy for that matter, which is more process driven and also consequential driven. I think maybe because a lot of times the consequences override for the kind of process that needs to be in place. And in some cases, the latter takes precedence over the former. So just your remarks on that, and then we can close. Thank you.
So I think there are two parallel things happening here. At one level, both as a citizenry and a state, we are living in times of deep disenchantment. If you go back to the constitution as a social contract that we forged for independent India, the constitution envisaged the state as playing not just an enabling role, but also a critical role to engineer deep social change in a fairly unequal and divided country as it was when we gained our independence. And over time, that belief in the credibility, capability, and capacity of the state has, I think, frayed. And it has frayed certainly for the citizenry. And that sort of goes back to my opening remarks about on the taxation story. But remarkably, I think it has also frayed internally within the state. On the one hand, politics and the deepening of our democracy provided a arena in which deep social conflict could be negotiated. But the state was viewed as a site for access to power rather than as a site that used its power to dispense social, economic rights and defend individual liberties and freedoms, as was the imagination of the Constitution. And the executive within the state, recognizing this perhaps, drew a culture where it felt that, in fact, the state just couldn't credibly deliver any of these core services. So it is quite interesting and intriguing to me that more often than not, when I talk to bureaucrats in the IAS, certainly, there is a very strong sense that the private sector will be able to deliver core public goods and merit goods, health and education, even roads, even security, far better than the public. So we are talking then about a state that is in retreat, not just because of an ideology of globalization, but a state that is in retreat because of a disenchantment with its credibility, and a voter that is forging a different kind of social contract with the state then. It is saying, okay, I'll take whatever redistributive crumbs you're willing to give me, and I'll also place my aspirations on you for a very different set of things. And those are the ideological and cultural battles that we are currently fighting. So, it is economists, not Ratin, but others, have often puzzled over why is it that a democratic country that is seen, for things have gone wrong over the last 5-6 years, but we credibly saw nearly 20 to 23 years of growth, and a large part of that was at about 8% to 10% growth. Why is it that a country that has lifted so many out of poverty still isn't able to forge a social contract where expectations of the state are for delivering health, education, good core public services? Expectations are different. I think it has to be traced back to the original social contract, to the disenchantment with it, to understand the place in which we are today. So I'll stop there.
Very quickly, I want to tell at least the students here, you see, if you look at the preamble to our constitution, you will see that the preamble says that the Indian state shall guarantee and deliver liberty and equality. But it shall only strive to promote fraternity. Fraternity is something that essentially comes out of society. And in the course of the Constituent Assembly debates, Mr. Ambedkar made a long intervention on fraternity and the lack of it, which is very important to his entire thesis for why we need to annihilate caste. That a low fraternity society could not possibly annihilate caste. I think what has happened in India is that we are paying the wages of low fraternity in a number of profound ways. The most profound is education. Most of your parents, I'm being very provocative here, but I have to say this to you, I don't think gave a damn about whether you were educated or not. They wanted you to get credentials, to get jobs, to service their old age. By coming to Jindal, I'm sure you've disappointed many of them. But as an asset class, I'm afraid that is what is expected of the young Indian. Now, if you don't care about education, then you will get what you ask for. And so the entire focus on this word education is a misnomer. Because we are a low fraternity society. Because it is only in a society that you have fraternity that education can enable you to transcend other boundaries and enjoy the company of your fellow citizens, to dream and act and maximize your own agency. But the moment I go into this space, you will notice many of you are probably thinking, just think of your uncles would say, "You are impractical." This is very impractical. You have to be practical. You cannot be practical and fraternal, you see. You have to be able to dream. And I think the great thing we did in India is that we engaged with how to overcome this low fraternity in our journey since independence. And sometime I would say after liberalization, one of the costs of following the principle of maximizing economic prosperity and not maximizing shared economic prosperity was the diminution of that already fragile and incomplete project. And you saw it in many manifestations. You saw it with the evolution of caste-based bargaining. You saw it with the evolution of local mafias and crime. And now you're seeing it with the success of a politics where every success comes by identifying an enemy within. And I think at the root of the problems that Yamini has very eloquently outlined just before me is our unwillingness to engage with the fact that on top of being a low trust society, and I'm not saying this about the state, I'm talking, think of your own families. Think of the WhatsApp groups that your uncles are in. Think of your own WhatsApp groups. A low fraternity, low trust society. And that is a terrible society if you wish to bring in shared prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, that's a point that one of our dean, was R. Sudarshan, keeps emphasizing extensively on. I've just shared for the students' purpose an article you'd written a few years ago on fraternity and economic transformation, which I recall, so shared it with the students. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity and for taking time out on a Saturday evening. And I know with the budget coming, everyone is looking at what's happening. So you have a lot of things lined up. But I just want to take this moment to thank our dear students who were working behind the scenes to work on the questions. And I think an excellent interaction. This is going to be archived, so students would have this as a reference for looking at this conversation. And I think going back to it again and again, because I think some of the underlying conversations that we have as part of Samvad, you can kind of replay a few of the sessions that I was doing before when we got into this edition. The one with Maitrish Ghatak, Professor Mehta. I think when we're looking back at this, some of the same things again and again that we came back into. So as students, I think it's very important that you look at these sessions as a way of knowing and expanding your perception rather than just taking an opportunity to be out there and ask what's the next thing that you can get to inquire about one statistic or fact. The intuition that you need to, I think, build is very important. So thank you, Siddharth, Ashu, Advaita, Snehal, Tejaswini, and thank you, Yamini and Ratan. And with that, we'll close this conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I better run, your poor driver is waiting patiently.